On December 8, 1941, at Clark Field in the Philippines, Japanese fighter pilots looked down from their Mitsubishi Zeros with something approaching contempt. They had just spent hours systematically destroying American air power on the ground, strafing rows of P-40 Warhawks and obsolete bombers that sat helpless in neat lines. Then they spotted something different. Among the smoking wreckage, a handful of four-engine bombers had survived, huge lumbering aircraft the Americans called B-17 Flying Fortresses. The Japanese pilots laughed at the name. Flying Fortresses. What kind of arrogant Americans would name a slow, defenseless bomber a fortress? These pilots, members of the elite Tainan Air Group, were the best Japan had. They flew the Zero, the most advanced carrier fighter in the world, a machine that could outmaneuver anything the Americans possessed. The B-17s they saw below looked massive and ungainly, industrial machines without elegance. Over the next 72 hours, Japanese pilots would shoot down or destroy on the ground dozens of these so-called fortresses. It seemed to confirm everything they believed. American bombers were easy prey. American technology was inferior. American will was weak. What the Japanese pilots didn't know, couldn't have known as they celebrated their victories that December, was that they had encountered only the earliest, most primitive versions of the Flying Fortress. They didn't know that within 18 months, the sky over the Pacific would darken with hundreds of these bombers. They didn't know that Boeing's engineers were already transforming their design. And they certainly didn't know that by 1943, Japanese commanders would forbid their convoys from sailing anywhere within range of American air power, all because of a single aircraft type, the B-17. The fortress they had mocked would become the weapon they feared most. The story begins not in the Pacific, but in Seattle, Washington. In the summer of 1935, the United States Army Air Corps had issued a request for proposals for a new multi-engine bomber. The requirements seemed straightforward enough. They wanted an aircraft that could carry 2,000 pounds of bombs for 1,000 to 2,000 miles at speeds between 200 and 250 miles per hour. The Boeing Aircraft Company, still recovering from the economic devastation of the Great Depression, made a calculated gamble. While their competitors, Martin and Douglas, interpreted multi-engine to mean two engines, Boeing went bigger, much bigger. They invested $275,000 of their own money, an enormous sum in 1935, to build a four-engine bomber that would dwarf anything America had ever produced. On July 28, 1935, the prototype, designated Model 299, rolled out onto the tarmac in Seattle. A reporter from the Seattle Times looked at the massive aircraft, with its gleaming aluminum skin and multiple machine gun positions bristling from the fuselage, and wrote a single phrase that would define the aircraft forever. Flying Fortress. The name was marketing genius, capturing both the defensive concept and the imposing physical presence of the machine. The Army Air Corps initially ordered 13 pre-production aircraft, designated Y-1B-17, and the first was delivered to the 2nd Bombardment Group at Langley Field, Virginia, on January 11, 1936. But tragedy nearly killed the program before it began. On October 30, 1935, the prototype crashed during a demonstration flight at Wright Field in Ohio, killing the test pilot. The investigation revealed that the crew had forgotten to remove the external gust locks on the control surfaces, a simple human error that had nothing to do with the aircraft design. But the crash gave skeptics ammunition. 4 engines meant 4 times the complexity, 4 times the maintenance problems, 4 times the cost. The Army Air Corps scaled back their initial orders dramatically. By 1939, the United States possessed fewer than 50 B-17 bombers in various configurations. The aircraft had critics throughout the military establishment who saw it as an expensive boondoggle, a theoretical weapon searching for a mission. Yet a small group of visionaries within the Army Air Corps believed that strategic bombing, the ability to strike deep into enemy territory and destroy industrial capacity, would decide future wars. They believed the B-17 represented the future of warfare. The early B-17 variants, the B, C, and D models, were learning platforms, each iteration improving on the last. The B-17C, which began production in 1940, carried a crew of 9 or 10, and was armed with just 4 50 caliber machine guns and a single 30 caliber gun in the nose. For defensive armament, this was pathetic. The B-17D added self-sealing fuel tanks and slightly more armor, bringing the total defensive armament to 6 50 caliber machine guns and 1 30 caliber. But these early fortresses had a critical vulnerability. They had virtually no rear defense. A Japanese or German fighter attacking from directly behind faced minimal opposition. The early B-17s also lacked the range, the bomb load, and the defensive firepower that would later make them legendary. They were, in many ways, incomplete designs, prototypes that happened to enter service because war came sooner than anyone expected. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, 12 B-17s from the 38th and 88th Reconnaissance Squadrons, flying from Hamilton Field in California, arrived over Oahu at the exact moment Japanese carrier aircraft were destroying the Pacific Fleet. The American bomber crews, exhausted from a 14-hour overnight flight, initially thought the anti-aircraft fire and the sight of Japanese fighters were part of a welcoming exercise. They had been told nothing about the attack. Within minutes, 0 fighters were tearing into the unarmed, defenseless B-17s. One fortress took over 200 bullet holes. Another broke in half on landing after being strafed on the runway. 10 of the 12 survived, but only barely. On December 8, 1941, at Clark Field in the Philippines, the Japanese struck with devastating effectiveness. Of the 35 B-17 stationed in the Philippines at the start of the war, 18 were destroyed on the ground during the first day of the attack. The surviving aircraft, outnumbered and outgunned, attempted desperate missions against Japanese invasion forces. On December 10th, Captain Colin P. Kelly, flying a B-17C, attacked what his crew believed was a Japanese battleship, though it was actually the heavy cruiser Ishiguro. Kelly's bombs missed their target, but his aircraft was hit by 0 fighters. With his B-17 on fire and losing altitude, Kelly held the controls steady long enough for his crew to bail out. He died when the aircraft exploded moments later. Kelly became one of the first American heroes of the war, posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. The Japanese fighter pilot credited with downing Kelly's fortress was none other than Saburo Sakai, who would become Japan's 4th highest scoring ace of the war. Years later, in his memoir Samurai, Sakai wrote about his encounter with a B-17. He had emptied multiple cannon bursts into the big bomber and watched it absorb punishment that would have torn a Japanese bomber to pieces. Even as it spiraled toward the earth in flames, trailing smoke and fire, the fortress remained structurally intact until the very end. Sakai admitted something that December morning that few Japanese pilots would acknowledge publicly. The B-17 impressed him. It could absorb an incredible amount of damage. It was tough. This from a pilot who had just helped Japan achieve one of the most stunning military victories in history. But Sakai's grudging respect was buried under Japanese euphoria. By the end of December 1941, Japanese forces had destroyed or captured nearly every American B-17 in the Pacific Theater. Only 17 airworthy fortresses remained from the original 90-plus aircraft stationed in Hawaii, the Philippines, and other Pacific bases. Japan controlled the entire Western Pacific. Their naval aviators had sunk the British battleship Prince of Wales and battlecruiser Repulse. They had attacked Wake Island, Guam, Singapore, Malaya, Hong Kong, and were driving toward the Dutch East Indies and Burma. Japanese military planners believed American would crumble under the weight of these early defeats. And Japanese fighter pilots, the cream of the Imperial Japanese Navy's air arm, believed they had encountered and defeated the best American heavy bomber. They had watched B-17s burn. They had seen them fall from the sky. The so-called flying fortress seemed to be nothing but American propaganda, a paper tiger with a grand name, but no substance. This assumption would cost Japan dearly. What changed everything was the B-17E, which began rolling off Boeing production lines in September 1941, though it didn't reach the Pacific Theater in significant numbers until early 1942. The E model represented a complete redesign. Boeing engineers added a massive tail section with a tail gunner position, finally giving the fortress rear defense. They enlarged the vertical stabilizer and redesigned the horizontal stabilizers to improve stability. They added powered gun turrets, a dorsal turret, and a ventral turret, though the ventral turret, with its complicated mirror sighting system, proved almost useless and was quickly replaced by the famous Sperry ball turret on later models. The B-17E carried 9 defensive machine guns, all 50 caliber Browning M2s capable of firing 750 to 850 rounds per minute out to an effective range of about 1,000 yards. The aircraft could carry 4,000 to 8,000 pounds of bombs, depending on the mission range. Crew armor was substantially increased. Self-sealing fuel tanks meant that bullet holes would automatically seal themselves, preventing catastrophic fuel loss and fire. The B-17E was still vulnerable, still slow compared to fighters, still dependent on formation, flying for mutual defensive fire. But it was no longer defenseless. Japanese pilots who had learned to attack B-17CS and DS from the rear now faced a tail gunner with twin 50 calibers. Those who tried frontal attacks still had a relatively easy time, as the nose armament remained weak. But the fortress was evolving, learning, improving with each combat encounter. By May 1942, B-17s equipped 5 bomb groups operating in the Pacific Theater. The 5th and 11th bombardment groups flew from Hawaii. The 19th and 43rd operated from Australia and New Guinea, and the 7th bombardment group deployed to India. These groups participated in the Battle of the Coral Sea and the Battle of Midway, attempting high-altitude bombing attacks against Japanese naval vessels. The results were disappointing. At Midway, B-17s dropped 315 bombs at Japanese carrier task forces. Not a single bomb struck a ship. High-altitude precision bombing against fast-moving, maneuvering naval vessels proved almost impossible. The Norden bomb sight, so accurate in controlled test conditions, couldn't compensate for wind, altitude variations, target movement, and the stress of combat. Japanese commanders drew the wrong conclusion from these failures. They concluded that B-17s were ineffective against shipping, that American strategic bombing doctrine was fundamentally flawed. This assessment seemed validated when Japanese forces captured 3 damaged B-17s in the Philippines and Java, 1D model and 2E models. Japanese engineers at the Gaiken, the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force's Air Technical Research Institute at Tachikawa Airfield, spent months rebuilding these aircraft from salvaged parts. They flew them. They tested them. They evaluated their strengths and weaknesses. They produced training films showing Japanese fighter pilots how to attack the fortress, exploiting its blind spots and vulnerable areas. They photographed the aircraft extensively. The Japanese concluded that while the B-17 was rugged and well-armed for its era, it remained vulnerable to concentrated fighter attack, especially from head-on angles. What the Japanese engineers couldn't anticipate was the pace of American industrial mobilization and design iteration. The B-17F, which began production in the summer of 1942, addressed many of the E model's shortcomings. The bomb bay was redesigned to carry heavier loads. The fuel tanks were expanded, extending range. The aircraft received strengthened landing gear to handle higher takeoff weights. The engines were upgraded to Wright Cyclone R-1820-97S, producing 1,200 horsepower each. Most importantly, late production B-17F models added additional nose armament, including twin 50 calibers in cheek positions and eventually a powered Bendix chin turret under the bombardier's position. The fortress was learning to defend itself from frontal attacks. Boeing, Douglas, and Lockheed Vega factories were all producing B-17s by late 1942. Production numbers were staggering. In 1941, only 512 B-17s of all models had been built. In 1942, production jumped to 3,405 aircraft. In 1943, American factories would produce 6,418 B-17s. In 1944, production peaked at 8,063 aircraft before declining to 2,278 in 1945 as the war wound down. In total, between 1935 and May 1945, American factories built 12,731 B-17 flying fortresses. This industrial capacity, this ability to design, build, and deploy thousands of complex 4-engine bombers while simultaneously producing tens of thousands of fighters, cargo aircraft, and training planes, represented a form of warfare Japan could never hope to match. By September 1942, the Pacific Theater had reached its peak B-17 deployment with 168 aircraft. But even as these numbers seemed impressive, Army Air Force planners were already deciding that the B-17 was wrong for the Pacific. The vast distances, the need for extremely long range, and the limited infrastructure for forward bases meant that the consolidated B-24 Liberator, with its longer range and higher service ceiling, was better suited for Pacific operations. By mid-1943, B-17s were being systematically withdrawn from Pacific bomber groups and replaced with B-24s. But before the transition was complete, the Flying Fortress would demonstrate exactly why Japanese commanders had begun to fear it. In early March 1943, Allied intelligence intercepted Japanese signals indicating a major troop convoy was being assembled at Rabaul in New Britain to reinforce the garrison at La in New Guinea. The convoy consisted of 8 troop transports carrying nearly 7,000 Japanese soldiers, 8 destroyers as escorts, and approximately 100 fighter aircraft, providing air cover. Japanese commanders believed that poor weather would shield the convoy during its transit across the Bismarck Sea. They were wrong. On March 1st, an American B-24 Liberator spotted the convoy through a break in the clouds. 8 B-17s were immediately dispatched, but failed to locate the ships in deteriorating weather. On March 2nd, the weather cleared. Multiple B-17 formations attacked throughout the day from altitudes between 5,000 and 10,000 feet, scoring hits on several transports. One transport, the Kyakusei Maru, carrying 1,200 troops, was sunk. Japanese fighter cover was aggressive but ineffective against the high-flying fortresses. The B-17 crews noted that while Zeros could reach their altitude, the thin air at 10,000 feet robbed the Japanese fighters of maneuverability. What they could do at sea level, they could not do at altitude. But March 3, 1943, became the day that changed Japanese naval strategy in the Pacific. At dawn, the convoy was within range of every Allied aircraft in theater. The attack came in coordinated waves. 13 B-17s struck from 7,000 feet, dispersing the convoy and forcing ships to maneuver independently. This broke up their concentrated anti-aircraft defense. Then came the revolutionary tactic. Modified B-25 Mitchell medium bombers and Australian Beaufighters attacked at masthead height, some flying as low as 50 feet above the water. The B-25s used skip bombing, a technique where bombs were dropped at extremely low altitude and literally skipped across the water like stones before slamming into the sides of ships. The Beaufighters, armed with 4 20mm cannons and 6 machine guns, strafed the destroyer escorts at point-blank range, silencing their anti-aircraft guns and killing crews in open mounts. Without anti-aircraft protection and separated from mutual support, the Japanese transports were helpless. The B-25s claimed 17 hits out of 28 bombs dropped, an extraordinary 60% hit rate. Above the carnage, more B-17 formations bombed from altitude, claiming 5 additional hits. The attack continued throughout the day. By the afternoon of March 3rd, all 8 Japanese transports were sinking or sunk. 4 of the 8 destroyer escorts were at the bottom of the sea. On the morning of March 4th, a B-17 caught the destroyer Asashio picking up survivors and sank her with a single 500-pound bomb. Of the nearly 7,000 Japanese troops who had left Rabaul, only about 1,200 made it to La. Another 2,700 were rescued and returned to Rabaul. The rest died in the water or reached remote islands, where many were hunted down by Allied patrols. The battle cost the Allies 4 aircraft, including one B-17 that was ripped apart by Zero fighters after her crew bailed out over the water. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was not simply a tactical victory. It represented a strategic turning point. A Japanese staff officer later said, "This defeat was the biggest cause of the loss of New Guinea. The empire had been bloodied and shocked." More importantly, Japanese Naval Command issued orders that would cripple their operations for the rest of the war. Never again would large convoys be allowed within range of substantial enemy air power. Japanese commanders who had laughed at American heavy bombers 18 months earlier now refused to send their ships anywhere B-17s could reach them. The fortress they had dismissed as slow and ungainly had helped destroy an entire troop convoy. While the low-level B-25s and bow fighters had done most of the killing, it was the B-17s that had dispersed the convoy, kept Japanese fighters occupied at high altitude, and provided continuous harassment. The psychological impact was devastating. Japanese soldiers and sailors knew that if American heavy bombers found them at sea, they would likely die. This fear was compounded by the knowledge that American bomber forces were growing exponentially, while Japanese air power was being slowly ground down through attrition. In Europe, a different drama was unfolding that would ultimately perfect the Flying Fortress. The 8th Air Force, based in England, began operations in August 1942 with small raids on targets in occupied France. By late 1943, the 8th was launching 1,000-bomber raids deep into Germany. The B-17G, the final and definitive production model, entered service in September 1943. It incorporated every lesson learned in 2 years of brutal combat. The G model added a powered Bendix chin turret with twin 50 calibers, giving the fortress finally effective frontal defense. Additional cheat guns were added to the nose. The waist gun positions were staggered to give gunners more room to operate. Late production models featured an improved Cheyenne tail turret. The final B-17G configuration carried 13 50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, 2 in the chin turret, 2 cheat guns in the nose, 2 in the upper Sperry turret, 2 in the Sperry ball turret in the belly, 2 staggered waist guns, 2 in the tail turret, 1 radio room gun firing upward from behind the bomb bay. Each gun position had hundreds of rounds of ammunition. The combined weight of fire from a single B-17G was formidable. When dozens or hundreds of fortresses flew in tight defensive formations, their overlapping fields of fire created what crews called a combat box, a three-dimensional formation where every aircraft's guns protected the others. German pilots who pressed home attacks faced walls of 50 caliber fire. The cost of creating this ultimate version of the Flying Fortress was written in blood over German skies. On August 17, 1943, the 8th Air Force launched a dual strike on Regensburg and Schweinfurt, deep in southern Germany. The mission involved 376 B-17s, the largest American raid to date. 60 bombers were lost. Nearly 600 men were killed, wounded, or missing in action. On October 14, 1943, Black Thursday, the 8th Air Force returned to Schweinfurt with 291 B-17s. 60 aircraft were lost again. Another 17 landed so badly damaged they would never fly again. The losses were unsustainable. Nearly 20% of the force was gone. The problem wasn't the B-17. The problem was that German fighter forces had grown stronger and more numerous, while American fighter escorts, P-47 Thunderbolts, didn't have the range to accompany bombers deep into Germany. B-17 formations flew hundreds of miles through enemy territory, relying solely on their defensive armament. The combat box formation helped, but concentrated German fighter attacks, often using head-on tactics, could still devastate bomber formations. The solution came in early 1944 with the deployment of the P-51 Mustang, a fighter with the range to escort bombers all the way to any target in Germany. With long-range fighter escort, B-17 losses dropped dramatically. By spring 1944, the 8th Air Force was launching missions of more than 1,000 bombers, supported by 800 fighters. The industrial might behind these numbers was staggering. By August 1944, the B-17 equipped 33 overseas combat groups. The 8th Air Force alone flew 440,000 bomber sorties over Germany by war's end in May 1945, dropping 697,000 tons of explosives. The 8th and the 15th Air Force in Italy, combined, dropped over 640,000 tons of bombs from B-17s, representing 42.6% of all tonnage dropped by Allied aircraft on Nazi Germany and occupied territories. These were numbers that had seemed impossible in December 1941. Boeing, Douglas, and Lockheed Vega plants were producing dozens of B-17s per week. The Douglas plant at Long Beach alone built 3,000 Fortresses. The Vega plant in Burbank produced 2,750. Boeing's Seattle plant produced over 6,900. Each aircraft required approximately 13,600 man-hours to build, involved subassembly from hundreds of suppliers, and contained nearly 500,000 individual parts. The Wright Cyclone engines came from different factories. The Sperry turrets were manufactured in New York. The Bendix Chin turret was built in South Bend, Indiana. The Norden bomb sight, one of America's most closely guarded secrets, was produced under armed guard at a dedicated facility. The entire production chain, from raw aluminum to flying bomber, represented an industrial ecosystem Japan could never replicate. 4 Japanese fighter pilots who had survived since 1941. The transformation was psychologically devastating. In 1941, they had faced B-17CS and DS with minimal defensive armament. By 1943, they faced B-17GS bristling with 13 heavy machine guns, flying in formations so tight that attacking one bomber meant facing the concentrated fire of dozens. Japanese pilots who had once laughed at the slow American bombers now approached them with dread. The Zero, which had dominated Pacific skies in 1941 and 1942, was now outmatched by American fighters and outgunned by American bombers. The Japanese aircraft industry, already struggling with limited resources and strategic bombing of its own factories, could not keep pace. While American fighters and bombers were constantly upgraded with more powerful engines, better armor, improved weapon systems, and advanced avionics, Japanese aircraft remained largely static. The A-6M0 of 1944 was fundamentally the same aircraft as the Zero of 1941. It was still fast and maneuverable, but it was now facing P-51 Mustangs, P-38 Lightnings, and F-6F Hellcats that were faster, better armed, more heavily armored, and flown by pilots backed by the full weight of American industry and training infrastructure. Japanese pilots who attacked B-17 formations in 1943 and 1944 often didn't survive the encounter. The Fortress's defensive firepower, combined with American fighter escorts, turned what had been relatively even combat in 1941 into a shooting gallery by 1944. The statistical reality of B-17 operations in Europe tells the story. In total, about 4,735 B-17s were lost during the war out of 12,731 built. This represents approximately 37% of all Fortresses produced. But these raw numbers conceal the human cost. Each B-17G carried a crew of 10 men: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, flight engineer, radio operator, ball turret gunner, tail gunner, and 2 waist gunners. The 8th Air Force suffered approximately 26,000 killed in action and another 28,000 who became prisoners of war, the highest casualty rate of any American military unit in World War II. Many bombers were hit dozens of times, but managed to limp home. Crews told stories of Fortresses returning with entire sections of tail or wing blown away, with 2 or 3 engines out, with hydraulic systems destroyed, with dozens of holes in the fuselage. The B-17's reputation for absorbing damage and bringing crews home was not propaganda. It was documented in thousands of after-action reports. One famous example, a B-17F named Justice Snappen, from the 100th Bomb Group, returned from Bremen on October 8, 1943, with over 800 holes in the airframe, 3 engines gone, most control surfaces shot away, and crash-landed in a field after hitting a tree. The crew survived. These stories of survival reinforced the Fortress's legend and gave crews confidence that even if hit, they had a chance of making it home. By 1945, when the B-29 Superfortress began operations in the Pacific and over Japan, the B-17 was already being phased out. The B-29 was larger, faster, longer-ranged, more heavily armed, and could carry a bigger bomb load. It represented the next generation of American strategic air power. B-17s were increasingly reassigned to air-sea rescue operations, dropping life rafts to downed aircrews, or converted to reconnaissance platforms. By the end of the war, in August 1945, most B-17s in combat service were relegated to secondary duties. Production ended in May 1945. The last Boeing-built B-17G rolled off the Seattle assembly line on April 13, 1945. Thousands of surplus B-17s were flown to disposal facilities like Walnut Ridge in Arkansas and Kingman in Arizona, where they were scrapped for aluminum. Some remained in service through the late 1950s as drone controllers or research platforms. A handful were purchased by civilian operators and converted to firefighting aircraft or executive transports. By the 1960s, finding an intact B-17 was rare. Today, fewer than 50 survive, most in museums. Only a handful remain in flying condition, carefully maintained by organizations dedicated to preserving aviation history. The story of the B-17 Flying Fortress is ultimately a story about transformation and industrial warfare. In December 1941, Japanese pilots looked at a handful of obsolete B-17CS and B-17DS and saw confirmation of their own superiority. American aircraft were inferior. American will was weak. The Flying Fortress was just a name, not a reality. But what they had witnessed was merely the beginning of something unprecedented in military history. Between 1941 and 1945, American industry produced 12,731 B-17s, each one more advanced than the last. Boeing, Douglas, and Vega factories perfected mass production techniques that built bombers faster than Japan could shoot them down. Engineers incorporated combat lessons in real time, adding armor here, improving turrets there, upgrading engines, strengthening airframes. What began as a vulnerable bomber with minimal defensive armament evolved into the B-17G, a flying battleship with 13 heavy machine guns and the ability to absorb punishment that would destroy lesser aircraft. The industrial ecosystem that supported this production, from aluminum refineries to engine plants to bomb site manufacturers, represented a form of economic warfare Japan could never hope to counter. The fortress that Japanese pilots mocked in December 1941 became the weapon that Japanese commanders feared by 1943. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea demonstrated that when American air power found Japanese naval forces, the result was annihilation. Over Europe, the sight of hundreds of B-17s darkening the sky, their contrails marking the destruction heading toward German cities, became a daily reminder of Allied industrial and technological supremacy. The 8th Air Force's 440,000 bomber sorties and 697,000 tons of explosives dropped represented a sustained campaign of strategic destruction that helped break Nazi Germany's capacity to wage war. But perhaps most tellingly, the B-17's greatest legacy was in the minds of those who faced it. Saburo Sakai, the Japanese ace who shot down Captain Colin Kelly's fortress in December 1941, admitted decades later that the B-17 had earned his respect even in that first encounter. He had watched the American bomber absorb punishment that would have destroyed any Japanese aircraft. He had seen it remain airborne when by all logic it should have fallen from the sky. He respected the fortress because it respected its crews, protecting them with armor and redundant systems and structural integrity. In his later years, Sakai became friends with many of the American pilots he had fought against. He sent his daughter to America to learn English and democracy. He prayed daily for the souls of the men he had killed. He acknowledged that both sides had fought with honor and that the B-17, the fortress he had once dismissed, represented something profound about American character. It was tough, resilient, capable of absorbing tremendous punishment, and ultimately victorious through the sheer weight of industrial capacity and technological innovation. The story of the B-17 is a reminder that warfare is not simply about the courage of individual soldiers or the tactical brilliance of commanders. It is about industrial capacity, about the ability to design, build, and deploy weapon systems faster than the enemy can counter them. It is about learning from defeat, incorporating lessons, and emerging stronger. Japan won the tactical victories of December 1941, destroying dozens of B-17s and dominating the Pacific. But America won the strategic war, building thousands of fortresses and eventually tens of thousands of other aircraft that overwhelmed Japanese defenses through sheer numerical superiority and technological advancement. The pilots who scoffed at flying fortresses in December 1941 were not fools. They were responding rationally to what they saw. Early model B-17s that were relatively easy to destroy. But what they couldn't see, what no one could see in those early days of the war, was the industrial mobilization that would transform the American military from a minor player into the most powerful military force the world had ever known. What do you think of the B-17 flying fortress? Was it the overwhelming industrial capacity that made it successful? Or was it genuinely a revolutionary aircraft design that changed the nature of strategic warfare? Could any other American bomber have achieved the same psychological and strategic impact? Or was there something unique about the fortress's reputation for toughness and crew survivability that made it irreplaceable? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.